The icy wind howled through the streets of New York City as 7-year-old Lily Walker wrapped her thin arms around herself, shivering in the tattered sweater that barely shielded her from the unforgiving cold. The streets were alive with people, but no one noticed the small girl with tangled brown hair and weary eyes. She had been walking aimlessly for hours, her stomach growling in protest, but she had grown used to hunger. It had been her silent companion for as long as she could remember. Ever since old Mrs. Jenkins, the kind woman who had taken her in, passed away, Lily had been alone. She had no idea who her real parents were, nor did she have any memory of them. The only life she had ever known was one of survival, searching for warm spots to sleep and hoping to find scraps of food left behind by strangers. That night, the cold was unbearable. The streets had begun to empty as people rushed to their homes, escaping the chilling wind that cut through the city like a knife. Lily's tiny fingers were numb as she rubbed them together, desperately trying to create some warmth. She spotted an open subway entrance and decided to go inside. The underground station was a temporary escape from the cruel night, a place where at least the wind wouldn't reach her. She made her way down the steps, her feet aching from walking all day, and found herself on the crowded platform. She stood near the edge, watching as the lights of an approaching train flickered through the tunnel. When the train came to a stop, she stepped inside, her breath visible in the cold air. The train was filled with people. Businessmen in expensive suits, tired workers heading home, and a few tourists clutching maps. Lily quietly moved toward an empty seat in the corner, but before she could sit, she noticed a man sitting alone near the window. Something about him felt different from the others. He had a strong presence, yet there was a sadness in his eyes as he stared at the city lights flashing past the window. His sharp features, neatly combed dark hair, and expensive suit made it clear that he belonged to a different world, one of wealth and power. He was Alexander Carter, though Lily had no idea who he was. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her tiny body. She hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him, curling up into the seat. The warmth of the subway car surrounded her like a soft blanket, and before she knew it, her heavy eyelids drooped shut. Her head, too weary to hold up any longer, gently rested against Alexander's shoulder. The billionaire stiffened at first, startled by the unexpected contact. He turned his head slightly, looking down at the little girl who had fallen asleep against him. Her face was peaceful, her breathing slow and steady. She looked so fragile, so helpless. For a moment, a memory flashed in his mind. His late wife holding their newborn daughter, a daughter he had lost the same day he lost his wife. His heart clenched at the thought. Alexander had built an empire from nothing, creating one of the most successful investment firms in the country. He had power, influence, and wealth beyond imagination. Yet, none of it had ever filled the emptiness inside him. He had spent years trying to drown his pain in work, convincing himself that money could buy everything, except the one thing he had lost forever. But now, as he looked at the little girl beside him, a strange feeling stirred within him. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at a forgotten part of his soul. The train rocked gently as it sped through the tunnels. Lily, unaware of the man beside her, shifted slightly in her sleep, her small fingers gripping the sleeve of his coat as if seeking comfort. Alexander exhaled, his tense posture relaxing slightly. He didn't have the heart to move her. The station announcements came and went, but he remained seated, watching over the child who had unknowingly sought warmth from a stranger. When the train finally reached the last stop, the conductor's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing the final destination. Lily stirred, blinking groggily as she realized she had fallen asleep. Her eyes widened when she saw where she was, still on the train, leaning against a man she didn't know. She quickly sat up, embarrassed and a little frightened. Alexander noticed her sudden panic and spoke gently, his voice calm and reassuring. "It's okay," he said. "You were tired." Lily looked at him, unsure of how to respond. Most people ignored her, pretended she didn't exist. But this man, a stranger, didn't seem annoyed by her presence. He didn't push her away or yell at her. Instead, there was a kindness in his voice, something she wasn't used to. "Are you lost?" he asked. Lily shook her head slowly. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted in a small voice. Alexander studied her for a moment, his mind racing. No child should be alone on the streets, especially not one so young. He had seen countless cases of neglect, had donated millions to charities helping the homeless, but he had never personally encountered a child in such a situation. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly midnight. Leaving her alone now wasn't an option. "Have you eaten?" he asked. Lily hesitated before shaking her head. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. Alexander sighed and stood up, adjusting his coat. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the train doors. "Let's get you something to eat." Lily hesitated. She had been warned about trusting strangers, but something about this man felt different. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would hurt her. And besides, the hunger was unbearable. After a brief moment of doubt, she slowly stood up and followed him. They stepped out of the station and onto the quiet streets of Manhattan. The city that never sleeps was still alive with flashing lights and the hum of traffic in the distance. Alexander led her to a nearby diner, a cozy little place that was still open. They sat in a booth by the window and Lily watched in wonder as he ordered a full meal for her, something she hadn't had in a long time. As the food arrived, Lily hesitated, staring at the warm plate in front of her. Alexander noticed her hesitation and smiled. "Go ahead," he said. "It's yours." She picked up the fork and took a small bite. The taste was overwhelming, warm, rich, delicious. Before she knew it, she was eating hungrily, forgetting all her manners. Alexander watched in silence, his heart heavy with emotions he couldn't explain. That night something changed. Neither of them knew it yet, but fate had brought them together for a reason. One was a lost little girl searching for warmth, and the other was a broken man who had unknowingly found the piece of his soul he had been missing for years. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The warm glow of the diner lights reflected off the glass windows as Lily sat in the corner booth, savoring every bite of the meal in front of her. The food was unlike anything she had tasted in a long time, fresh, hot, and full of flavors that made her stomach feel warm for the first time in days. Across from her, Alexander Carter watched in silence, his fingers loosely wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. He wasn't sure why he had brought her here or why he felt a strange responsibility toward her, but something deep inside him told him that this moment was important. Lily, despite her hunger, ate slowly now, stealing glances at the man sitting across from her. He was different from the people she had encountered before. He didn't look at her with pity, nor did he try to send her away. There was something distant in his eyes, as if he were lost in thoughts he wasn't ready to share. The soft hum of conversation from the other late-night diners filled the air, but for a few moments, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. After finishing her meal, Lily wiped her mouth with the napkin, suddenly aware that she had eaten more than she usually did in a day. She hesitated before speaking, unsure if she should say anything at all. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander looked up, surprised by the gratitude in her eyes. He simply nodded, not knowing what to say. The truth was, he had never considered himself a kind man. He had built his empire on ruthless decisions, cutting off anything that made him weak. But sitting across from this little girl, who had no home and no one to look after her, he felt something stir inside him. "Where do you sleep at night?" he asked, his voice neutral, though his heart clenched at the thought of her being alone in the freezing city. Lily shrugged, playing with the hem of her oversized sweater. "Sometimes under the bridge near Central Park. Other times I find a warm spot in the subway station." She said it so casually as if it were normal. But Alexander knew better. The streets were dangerous, especially for a child. He had seen stories in the news, children disappearing, becoming victims of the cruel world that didn't care for the weak. He couldn't bring himself to let that happen to her. He exhaled, setting his coffee cup down. "You can't sleep on the streets anymore," he said firmly. Lily's eyes widened slightly, her posture stiffening. She had heard promises before, people offering help, only to disappear when it was inconvenient for them. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice cautious. It wasn't an unreasonable question. No one had ever cared before. Alexander didn't have an answer. He could have said it was because he didn't want to see a child suffer. He could have made up some logical excuse. But deep down, something about her felt familiar. "You remind me of someone," he finally admitted. He wasn't sure if it was the right thing to say, but it was the truth. Lily tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her tired eyes. "Who?" Alexander hesitated before answering. "My daughter," he said, his voice quieter than before. It had been years since he had said those words aloud. The memory of his late wife holding their baby girl flashed in his mind, the way she had looked at him, full of love and hope. But that hope had died the day she did, and with her so had their child. Or so he had thought. Lily frowned slightly, as if trying to understand his words. "Where is she?" she asked. The question felt like a knife to his chest. He forced himself to swallow the lump in his throat. "She died a long time ago," he said, his voice emotionless. It was the only way he knew how to speak about it without breaking. Lily looked down at her lap as if trying to process his pain. She knew what it was like to lose someone, even if she had never truly known her own parents. She had felt the sting of loneliness her entire life. A silence settled between them, heavy yet oddly comforting. Then Alexander made a decision, one he knew would change both their lives. "You can stay with me for now," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Lily's head snapped up, her eyes filled with shock. "What?" she asked as if she had misheard him. Alexander leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "I have a guest room. You can stay there until we figure something out." Lily wasn't sure if she should trust him. He was a stranger after all. But something in his voice told her he wasn't lying. He wasn't offering charity, he was offering something real. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Okay," she finally said, her voice small. Alexander nodded as if that settled everything. He pulled out his wallet, leaving enough cash on the table to cover the meal, and stood up. "Let's go," he said. Lily hesitated for only a moment before following him out of the diner and into the crisp night air. The streets of New York were quieter now, the neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement. They walked in silence, the only sound being the distant hum of the city. A black luxury car was parked near the curb, and Alexander gestured for her to get in. She hesitated, looking up at him, searching for any sign of deceit. But his face remained calm, patient. Taking a deep breath, she climbed into the car, feeling the soft leather seats beneath her. It was warmer inside, the air smelling of something unfamiliar, something expensive. As they drove through the city, Lily stared out the window, watching the lights blur past. She had never been inside a car like this before, never felt so out of place yet strangely safe. Alexander, on the other hand, found himself glancing at her through the rearview mirror. There was something about her that pulled at his heart in a way he hadn't expected. It was a strange feeling, one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. When they arrived at his penthouse, Lily stepped inside, her eyes widening at the sheer size of it. The polished floors, the grand staircase, the massive windows overlooking the city, it was nothing like the world she knew. Alexander led her to a guest room, the space larger than any place she had ever called home. "You can sleep here," he said. "There are clean clothes in the closet. If you need anything, let me know." Lily nodded, still overwhelmed. She had never had a room before. Never had a bed that wasn't a piece of cardboard or a cold bench. As Alexander turned to leave, she spoke up. "Thank you," she said again. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at her. For a moment, something in his chest tightened. He simply nodded before closing the door behind him. That night, Lily lay in the softest bed she had ever known, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all a dream. And in his room, Alexander sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the old photograph of his wife and daughter, feeling a ghost of a memory he had buried long ago. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: everything had changed. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The soft morning light streamed through the large windows of the penthouse, casting a warm glow on the sleek furniture and marble floors. Lily stirred in the massive bed, the softness of the pillows still unfamiliar against her skin. She blinked, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. She was in a place she had never imagined, far from the cold streets, the hunger, and the uncertainty of survival. The room smelled fresh, like clean linen and something faintly floral, a scent she couldn't quite place. For a few minutes she simply lay there, afraid that if she moved, it would all disappear and she would wake up back under the bridge, shivering in the morning cold. Meanwhile, in the living room, Alexander sat in his usual spot, a cup of black coffee in his hand, staring at the city skyline. He had been up for hours, lost in thoughts he wasn't ready to confront. The girl in the other room, Lily, was still a stranger to him, yet he had brought her into his home without a second thought. That wasn't like him. He wasn't the type of man who let emotions dictate his decisions. He had built his life on logic, strategy, and a relentless drive for success. But something about her had pulled at him in a way nothing else had in years. She reminded him of the past, a past he had tried to forget. A soft sound made him turn his head. Lily stood in the hallway, hesitant, her oversized sweater hanging loosely from her small frame. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, darted around the space as if trying to understand where she truly was. Alexander cleared his throat. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice steady. Lily nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of her sleeves. "Yeah," she murmured. It felt strange to be here, in a home so grand that it didn't seem real. "You must be hungry," Alexander said, standing up. "Come, let's get you something to eat." The kitchen was unlike anything Lily had ever seen, sleek, modern, with state-of-the-art appliances that looked untouched. Alexander moved effortlessly, pulling out ingredients from the fridge. Within minutes, he placed a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit in front of her. She stared at the food, hesitant. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, watching her. "Eat." She picked up the fork, taking a small bite. The taste was simple yet comforting. As she ate, she felt Alexander's gaze on her, studying her as if he were trying to figure something out. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. Lily hesitated, chewing slowly. "A few years," she admitted. "Since I was little." She didn't know her exact age, but she knew she had been alone for as long as she could remember. She had no memories of a warm home, no images of parents tucking her into bed. Only the streets, the hunger, and the cold. Alexander's grip on his coffee cup tightened. The more she spoke, the more an unsettling feeling grew inside him. He had spent years building his empire, focusing on wealth and power, never once thinking about the child he had lost so long ago. But now, as he sat across from this girl, something deep inside him whispered a truth he wasn't ready to hear. As breakfast ended, Lily wiped her mouth and looked up. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice small. It was a question that had been lingering in her mind since last night. People didn't just help without a reason. Alexander met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because no one else has," he finally said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for now. The rest of the morning passed in quiet moments. Lily explored the penthouse, marveling at the view from the massive windows. She ran her fingers over the polished bookshelves, her eyes scanning the titles she couldn't even begin to understand. It was a world so different from her own that it felt like stepping into a dream. Later that afternoon, Alexander received a call from his assistant, informing him about an urgent business meeting. He hesitated before glancing at Lily, who sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine she could barely read. He wasn't sure if he should leave her alone, but there was no choice. "I have to go out for a while," he said. "Will you be okay here?" Lily nodded, though a small part of her felt uneasy. She wasn't used to being inside a place like this, let alone being left alone in one. "There's food in the fridge," Alexander added. "And if you need anything, I'll be back soon." As soon as he left, the silence in the penthouse felt overwhelming. Lily wandered through the rooms, touching the soft cushions, staring at the massive television, walking through the long hallways. Everything was too perfect, too unreal. She found herself in Alexander's study, her fingers tracing over the desk. Papers were neatly stacked, a laptop sat open but locked. But it was the framed photo that caught her attention. A woman with gentle eyes smiled in the picture, holding a baby wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Lily stared at it, something stirring in her chest. She had never seen Alexander look at anyone with emotion, but this woman, there was something different in the way he stood beside her in the picture. Carefully she picked up the frame, studying the baby. Something about the tiny face felt familiar. A chill ran through her spine. The sound of the elevator startled her, and she quickly placed the photo back. Alexander stepped in, loosening his tie, looking exhausted. He froze for a second when he saw her in his study but said nothing. Lily swallowed hard. "Who is she?" she asked, pointing at the photo. Alexander's expression darkened. "My wife," he said, his voice distant. Lily bit her lip. "And the baby?" For the first time she saw something raw in his eyes, something he had kept buried for years. "My daughter," he said quietly. She died a long time ago." Lily's heart pounded. She turned back to the picture, her fingers clenching the edge of her sweater. She wanted to ask more, but something told her it wasn't the time. Instead, she simply nodded, stepping away. That night, as she lay in the massive bed, her mind raced. Something about that picture wouldn't leave her thoughts. The way the baby's small face seemed so familiar. The way Alexander looked at her as if he were searching for something. And deep inside her, a strange, terrifying thought began to form, one she wasn't ready to say aloud. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The night passed slowly, and Lily found herself tossing and turning in the massive bed, her thoughts tangled in confusion and unease. The image of the baby in the picture haunted her, stirring something deep inside her that she couldn't explain. The way Alexander had spoken about his daughter, his lost daughter, sent a strange chill through her. Could it be possible? No, she told herself, shaking her head. It was just a coincidence. There was no way she could be connected to him in such a way. Yet, something inside her whispered that she needed to know more. The next morning, she woke up to the soft scent of breakfast drifting through the penthouse. She hesitated before stepping out of the bedroom, unsure if she was even supposed to be here anymore. But when she reached the kitchen, Alexander was already there, pouring coffee into a cup, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said without looking up. Lily nodded, sliding into a chair. A plate of pancakes and fruit was already set for her, as if he had known she would be hungry. She picked up her fork but hesitated before taking a bite. "About last night," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander exhaled, setting his cup down. "You have questions," he said, already knowing where this conversation was headed. Lily nodded. I feel like I've seen that baby before." She wasn't sure why she said it, but once the words were out, she couldn't take them back. Alexander's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's just, something about her felt familiar. Like I've seen that face before." Alexander remained silent for a long moment, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. He had spent years shutting out the pain of losing his daughter. He never talked about her, never allowed himself to dwell on what had been taken from him. But now, sitting across from this girl who had appeared out of nowhere, something inside him stirred in a way he couldn't ignore. "Lily," he said carefully, "what do you remember about your past?" Lily looked down at her plate, pushing a piece of pancake around with her fork. "Not much," she admitted. "I was really young when I ended up alone. I don't remember my parents. I don't even know if I had any." Alexander's chest tightened. He didn't know why, but his instincts told him there was something more to this. He had always believed that his daughter had died as a baby, that was what he had been told. But what if that wasn't the truth? The thought made his heart pound in a way he hadn't felt in years. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to check something," he muttered, walking towards his office. Lily sat frozen for a moment before following him, curiosity and fear twisting inside her. Inside the office, Alexander pulled open a locked drawer in his desk, taking out an old folder. The papers inside were slightly worn, as if they had been handled many times before. He flipped through them quickly until he found what he was looking for, a birth certificate. His hands trembled slightly as he scanned the name written there. Lily peered over his shoulder, her heart racing. "What is that?" she asked. Alexander hesitated before turning the document towards her. "This is my daughter's birth certificate," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Her name was Lillian. Lily stared at the name, her breath catching in her throat. Lillian. It wasn't just similar to her name, it was her name. She felt her stomach drop, her hands growing cold. "Lillian?" she whispered, the name tasting familiar yet foreign at the same time. Alexander studied her reaction closely. "Lily," he said slowly, what if you are my daughter?" The words sent a shiver down her spine. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "That's not possible. I mean, it doesn't make sense, right?" But her voice wavered, betraying the doubt creeping into her heart. Alexander took a deep breath. "There's only one way to know for sure," he said. "A DNA test." Lily swallowed hard. The idea of knowing the truth terrified her. What if she really was his daughter? What if everything she thought she knew about herself had been a lie? But another part of her, the part that had spent years longing for answers, wanted to know. She met his gaze and nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Alexander made arrangements for a DNA test, his usual efficiency kicking in, though his mind was clouded with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had always thought he had lost his daughter forever. But if Lily truly was Lillian, it would change everything. Lily, on the other hand, couldn't stop shaking. She paced around the penthouse, her thoughts running wild. What if she really did have a family? What if she had been living on the streets all these years while her father had been right here, a millionaire with everything she had never had? The idea was overwhelming. That evening, as they sat in silence, waiting for the test results to come back in the following days, Lily finally spoke. "If I am your daughter, what happens then?" Alexander looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then you stay here," he said firmly. "With me. Where you belong." Lily's throat tightened. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. She had spent so long being alone that the idea of belonging somewhere felt foreign. But deep down she knew she wanted it. More than anything, she wanted to believe that she had a home. As night fell over New York City, neither of them spoke again, but the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. The truth was coming, and no matter what the results said, their lives would never be the same again. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The days leading up to the DNA test results were the longest of Lily's life. Every moment felt like an eternity, Every glance Alexander gave her was filled with silent questions. She tried to act normal, but how could she? Her entire existence was hanging in the balance. She had never allowed herself to dream of something like this, that she might actually have a family, that she wasn't just another forgotten soul in the streets of New York. But at the same time, the possibility terrified her. What if the results came back and proved that she wasn't his daughter? What if she had allowed herself to hope for nothing? She had spent years surviving on nothing but her own strength, and now, for the first time, she was letting herself rely on the possibility of someone else. The thought made her uneasy. Alexander was equally restless, though he hid it better. He had spent so many years believing his daughter was gone that he wasn't sure how to process the idea that she might be sitting right in front of him. Every time he looked at Lily, he searched for traces of the baby he had lost. The curve of her nose, the way she bit her lip when she was nervous, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the table when she was thinking, it all felt familiar in a way that made his chest ache. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but in his heart he already knew. He felt it. He knew she was his daughter. But he also knew that feeling wasn't enough. He needed proof, and until then he had to remain cautious. The results were due to arrive that evening, and the weight of anticipation was unbearable. Lily had spent the afternoon pacing around the penthouse, unable to focus on anything. She had tried watching TV, flipping through books, even just staring out at the New York skyline, but nothing helped. Every time her mind wandered, it went straight to the possibilities of what the results would say. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She found Alexander in his office, his face tense as he stared at his laptop screen. "I can't do this," she blurted out, making him look up. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he admitted. "But we have to." "What if it's a mistake?" she whispered. "What if this is all just some crazy coincidence?" Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "And what if it's not?" His voice was quiet, but there was something strong behind it, something that made Lily's chest tighten. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk. Both of them froze. The results. Alexander hesitated for only a second before picking up the phone. His expression was unreadable as he read through the message, his eyes scanning over the words again and again as if trying to make sense of them. Lily clenched her fists, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Then, slowly, Alexander set the phone down and looked at her. His eyes were filled with something raw, something overwhelming. "It's you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lily, you're my daughter." The world seemed to stop. Lily felt like she couldn't breathe. Her mind struggled to process the words, to make sense of what they meant. She had spent so many years alone, believing she had no one, that she was just another lost girl in the world. And now, in one instant, that had changed. She had a father. A real, living, breathing father who had been searching for her without even knowing it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't even realize she was crying until Alexander stood up and took a hesitant step toward her. "Lily," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't even know what to say. I thought you were gone. I thought I lost you forever." Lily shook her head, unable to form words. She had spent years building walls around herself, protecting herself from hope, from disappointment. But now all of that was crumbling. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: safe. Without thinking, she took a shaky step forward, then another. And then suddenly she was in his arms, clinging to him as sobs racked her body. Alexander held her tightly, his own tears silent but just as powerful. For years he had buried his grief, forced himself to move on. But now, standing here with his daughter in his arms, he let himself feel everything: the loss, the pain, the relief, the overwhelming love that had never faded. "I'm so sorry," he murmured against her hair. "I should have found you sooner. I should have." "You didn't know," Lily choked out, shaking her head. "You thought I was gone." "I didn't know either." They stood like that for what felt like forever, neither willing to let go. The world outside kept moving, cars honking, people walking through the streets of New York, but inside this room time had stopped. Eventually, Alexander pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. "You never have to be alone again." Lily wiped her eyes, nodding. She had no idea what the future held, what this new reality meant for her. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't scared. She had a home now. A father. A family. And maybe, just maybe, that was all she had ever wanted. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The days following the DNA results felt like a strange dream for Lily. She had spent so much of her life fending for herself that the idea of suddenly belonging somewhere felt foreign. Alexander had immediately insisted she stay in the penthouse, refusing to let her return to the streets. At first she resisted. She wasn't used to accepting help, and the idea of suddenly having a father, a home and a life of comfort was overwhelming. But Alexander was patient. He gave her space when she needed it but never let her feel like she was alone. Slowly she started to settle in. The first morning she woke up in a soft, warm bed, a bed that belonged to her. She wasn't huddled under a thin blanket on a park bench, she wasn't worrying about where her next meal would come from. Instead, she was in a room with a window overlooking Central Park, with breakfast waiting for her downstairs. It was a luxury she wasn't sure she'd ever get used to. Alexander did his best to make things easier for her. He didn't push, didn't overwhelm her with questions about her past. He simply made sure she knew she was welcome. He took her shopping for clothes, helped her set up a bank account, and even hired a tutor to help her catch up on all the education she had missed. At first she resisted the changes. She had been alone for so long that relying on someone else felt unnatural. But as time passed, she started to see that Alexander wasn't just trying to help her. He was trying to make up for the years they had lost. And despite everything, despite the wall she had built around herself, she found herself wanting to let him in. One afternoon they took a drive out to Brooklyn where Alexander had lived years ago. As they drove through the streets, he told her stories about his past, how he had started his business with nothing, how he had struggled before finally making it. It was strange to think of him as anything other than the powerful millionaire she knew now, but hearing about his struggles made him seem more human, more real. "I wasn't always like this," he admitted, glancing at her. "There was a time when I barely had enough money for rent. I used to sit on these same streets, wondering how I was going to make it." Lily looked out the window watching the people walking by, each one lost in their own world. "I guess we're not so different," she murmured. Alexander smiled. "I guess not." That night, as they sat in the penthouse watching an old movie, Lily found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She didn't have to worry about sleeping with one eye open, didn't have to worry about where she would find her next meal. She was safe. And more than that, she was wanted. But not everything was easy. Adjusting to this new life wasn't as simple as just accepting it. She still had nightmares, still woke up in a panic sometimes, afraid it had all been a dream. And then there were the doubts, the lingering fear that it was all too good to be true. What if Alexander changed his mind? What if something happened and she was back on the streets? The uncertainty haunted her. One evening, after a particularly bad nightmare, she found herself standing on the balcony, staring out at the city. The lights stretched out endlessly, a constant reminder of how small she had once felt in this vast world. She didn't hear Alexander approach until he was standing beside her. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Just thinking." He nodded as if he understood. "It's a lot to take in." Lily hesitated before speaking. "I keep waiting for it to disappear. For it all to be taken away." Alexander turned to face her. "That's not going to happen, Lily. You're my daughter. You belong here." She wanted to believe him. More than anything, she wanted to trust that this was real. But years of surviving on her own had taught her not to rely on anyone. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to just be normal." Alexander sighed, his expression soft. "You don't have to be anything you're not. You've been through more than most people ever will. It's going to take time and that's okay. I'm not going anywhere." His words settled something inside her. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she belonged. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Lily had started to settle into her new life, but the transition wasn't as smooth as she had hoped. Despite Alexander's kindness, the weight of her past still clung to her, making it hard to fully embrace this sudden change. She often found herself wandering the penthouse late at night, staring out at the New York City skyline, wondering if she truly belonged here. The luxury around her felt unreal, like she was living someone else's life. She wasn't used to soft beds, warm meals, or people who actually cared about her well-being. It was almost too much to accept. Alexander, on the other hand, was doing everything in his power to make her feel at home. He had gone from being a powerful, no-nonsense businessman to a man who was trying to reconnect with a daughter he never knew he had. He tried to be patient, giving her space while also making sure she knew he was there for her. But Lily could see it in his eyes. He was afraid of losing her before he ever truly got to know her. One afternoon, Alexander took her to a small cafe in Brooklyn, a place he used to visit when he was younger. It wasn't the kind of high-end restaurant he was used to now, but it was clear the place held sentimental value for him. They sat by the window sipping coffee, and for the first time, Lily saw a glimpse of who Alexander had been before the wealth, before the power. He told her stories about his childhood, about how he had grown up in a tiny apartment with his mother, struggling to make ends meet. He spoke about the nights he had spent wondering if he would ever escape the cycle of poverty, how he had worked tirelessly to build his business from the ground up. Lily listened intently, surprised by how much she related to his struggles. She had spent her entire life believing she was alone, that no one could understand what it felt like to be abandoned, to fight for survival. But here was a man who had once been just like her. The difference was that he had found a way out. And now, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, he was offering her the same chance. That evening, back at the penthouse, Lily sat on the couch, flipping through an old photo album Alexander had given her. It was filled with pictures of him as a young man, standing in front of the first office he had ever rented, posing with his mother in their tiny apartment, attending business meetings when he was still struggling to make a name for himself. Seeing him like that, before the wealth, before the success, made her realize that he wasn't as different from her as she had thought. But just as she was beginning to let her guard down, reality came crashing back in. The next morning she received an unexpected call from an old acquaintance, Jake, one of the boys she used to hang out with when she lived on the streets. Jake had always been trouble, but he had also been one of the few people who had looked out for her when no one else did. Hearing his voice brought back a flood of memories, and for a moment she felt like she was being pulled back into her old life. Jake was in trouble. He had gotten mixed up with the wrong people and now he needed money, fast. "Lily, please," he begged over the phone. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice. These guys, they're serious. If I don't pay them back, I don't know what's gonna happen to me." Lily felt torn. A part of her wanted to walk away, to leave that life behind and focus on her future. But another part of her couldn't ignore the fact that Jake had once been there for her when she had no one. She didn't want to turn her back on him. But how could she ask Alexander for help? She had barely begun to earn his trust. Asking for money for someone like Jake would only make him question whether she was taking advantage of him. That night she sat in her room staring at the phone, debating what to do. She could try to find the money on her own, but she had no real way of earning it. The only person who had the means to help was Alexander. But what if he said no? What if he saw her as nothing more than another person trying to take advantage of his wealth? She barely slept that night, and by morning she knew she had to tell Alexander the truth. Over breakfast she hesitated before speaking. "I need to ask you something," she said carefully. Alexander set down his coffee, watching her with concern. "Of course. What is it?" Lily took a deep breath. "It's about someone from my past. His name is Jake. We used to look out for each other when I was living on the streets. He's in trouble and he needs help." Alexander's expression remained unreadable. "What kind of trouble?" Lily hesitated. "He owes money to some dangerous people. He says they're going to come after him if he doesn't pay." Alexander sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lily, I understand that you feel loyal to him. But getting involved in situations like this isn't a good idea. If he owes money to dangerous people, giving him money won't fix the problem. It might just make it worse." Lily clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. "I can't just turn my back on him. He helped me when I had no one." Alexander looked at her carefully. "And what happens if you give him money and he gets into trouble again? Will you keep bailing him out?" Lily fell silent. She hadn't thought about that. Alexander reached across the table, his voice softer now. "I know you want to help, but there are other ways. Let me talk to some people, see if I can find a safer solution. But giving him money isn't going to solve anything." Lily wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Jake had always been reckless, always finding ways to get into trouble. She hated the idea of abandoning him, but she also couldn't risk everything she had just started to build. Later that night she sat on the balcony staring out at the city. She thought about Jake, about her past, about the life she had barely escaped. She wasn't sure what the right answer was, but one thing was clear. She couldn't keep living with one foot in the past and one in the future. She had to make a choice. As the city lights shimmered around her, she made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't going to let her past define her. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward without leaving behind the people who had mattered to her. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Lily had spent the entire night thinking about what Alexander had said. His words echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She couldn't keep holding on to her past if she truly wanted a future. But walking away from Jake felt like betraying someone who had once been her only family. The morning air in New York was crisp as she stepped out onto the balcony, watching the streets below. The city was always awake, always moving, and she realized that if she wanted to survive, she had to move forward too. She picked up her phone and called Jake. His voice was filled with desperation, but she forced herself to be firm. She told him she couldn't get him the money, that she was trying to build something new for herself. He was silent for a long moment before he finally muttered, "Guess I should have known. You're one of them now." The line went dead and Lily felt her heart sink. She tried to go about her day as usual, but the weight of guilt pressed down on her. Alexander noticed her quiet mood over breakfast and didn't push her to talk, but he gave her a look that told her he knew exactly what she was thinking about. Instead of bringing it up, he suggested they take a drive out of the city. "I want to show you something," he said. Lily hesitated but eventually agreed. They drove out of Manhattan, passing through the suburbs and heading toward a quieter part of New York, Westchester County. The further they got from the towering skyscrapers, the more Lily felt like she could breathe. Alexander finally pulled up in front of a large, well-maintained building with a sign that read, Horizon Youth Center. Lily frowned in confusion as he led her inside. The moment they walked through the doors, she understood. The center was filled with kids and teenagers, some sitting in small groups, others playing basketball in the courtyard. It was a place for kids who had nowhere else to go, much like she had once been. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approached them. "Alexander, it's been a while," she said before turning to Lily. "You must be Lily. He's told me a lot about you." Lily was taken aback. "You run this place?" she asked, glancing at Alexander. He nodded. "I started funding it years ago. It's for kids who need help, kids like you and Jake. I wanted you to see that there are other ways to help people besides just handing them money." Lily walked through the center, taking everything in. She saw kids laughing, talking, and learning. She saw a world she had never known existed, a place where people actually cared about kids like her. As she watched, a thought struck her. Maybe she couldn't save Jake the way he wanted, but that didn't mean she couldn't make a difference. As they drove back to the city, Lily was lost in thought. Alexander didn't push her, giving her time to process everything. That night, she made another decision. She called Jake again. When he answered, his voice was cold. "What do you want?" he asked. "I can't give you money," she said firmly. "But I can help you if you're willing to let me." She told him about the center, about how they could help him get off the streets, find a real future. There was a long silence. Then Jake laughed bitterly. "You think some charity is gonna fix this? These people don't care about us, Lily." "They do," she insisted. "And I care too. But I can't help you if you don't want to help yourself." He muttered something under his breath before hanging up. Lily sat there, staring at the phone, unsure if she had done the right thing. But deep down she knew she had to let him make his own choices, just like she had to make hers. The next few weeks were different for Lily. She started spending more time at the youth center, getting to know the kids, helping where she could. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. One evening, as she was leaving the center, she saw a familiar figure leaning against the fence. Jake. He looked rough, his clothes worn, his face tired. But there was something different in his eyes. "I don't know if this place can help me," he admitted. "But I don't have anywhere else to go." Lily felt a lump in her throat. "Then let's find out," she said, leading him inside. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Lily never thought her life would change so drastically in just a few months. The streets of New York had always been her battleground, a place where she had learned to survive with nothing but sheer determination. Now, standing in front of the Horizon Youth Center, she felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. The kids here reminded her of herself, lost, searching, hoping for a way out. Jake had been staying at the center for a few weeks now, and though he was still skeptical, she could see the change in him. The anger in his eyes had dulled, replaced with something that resembled hope. It wasn't easy for him to let go of his old ways, but at least he was trying. Alexander had been right all along. Helping someone wasn't just about throwing money at them, it was about showing them that they had a future. One evening, as Lily was helping one of the younger kids with homework, Jake walked up to her. He looked hesitant, like he had something to say but wasn't sure how to start. "I got a job," he finally said, shoving his hands into his pockets. Lily's eyes widened in surprise. "You did?" He nodded. "Yeah. It's just at a diner washing dishes, but it's something." Lily couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. She knew how big of a step this was for him. "That's amazing, Jake," she said. "I'm really proud of you." He looked away embarrassed, but she could tell her words meant something to him. That night, she sat on the balcony of Alexander's penthouse, staring out at the city. It was strange to think about how much had changed. She had gone from sleeping on the streets to having a home, a job, and people who genuinely cared about her. Alexander had given her a life she never thought she could have, and now she was using it to help others. But there was still something unresolved. She had never asked Alexander why he had taken such an interest in her, why he had gone out of his way to help a girl he had barely known. The question had been sitting in the back of her mind for weeks, but she had been too afraid to ask. The next morning she found him in his study going over some paperwork. Taking a deep breath, she walked in and sat down across from him. "Can I ask you something?" He glanced up from his work, nodding. "Of course." She hesitated before finally speaking. "Why did you help me? I mean, really help me. Most people wouldn't have bothered." Alexander put down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "Because I knew who you were," he said finally. Lily frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" He sighed as if debating how to say what he needed to. "I knew your mother." Lily felt her heart stop. "What?" Alexander nodded. "A long time ago, before I became this," he gestured around the luxurious office, "I was just a struggling businessman trying to make it in this city. Your mother, Emily, was the only person who believed in me. She helped me when I had nothing. We were close, but life took us in different directions. I didn't know she had a daughter until recently." Lily's head was spinning. Her mother had never talked about her past, and now here was Alexander, telling her that he had known her. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted you to trust me on your own terms," he said. "I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything." Lily felt tears sting her eyes. She had spent so long thinking she was alone, that no one had cared about her or her mother. But all this time Alexander had been watching out for her, not because he had to, but because he had loved her mother once. It was overwhelming. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. He smiled softly. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that you're not alone, Lily. You never were." For the first time in her life she truly believed it. She wasn't just some abandoned street kid anymore. She had a home, a future, and a family, even if it wasn't the one she had expected. Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into her work at the youth center, helping kids like her find their own second chances. Jake was doing better too, and though he still had a long way to go, she knew he was finally on the right path. One evening, as she was closing up the center, Jake walked up to her with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said. "Maybe it's time I leave the city? Start fresh somewhere else." Lily felt a pang in her chest, but she knew he was right. New York had been their battlefield, but it didn't have to be their prison. "Where will you go?" she asked. He shrugged. "Not sure yet. But I want to see what else is out there." She nodded, fighting back tears. "I think that's a great idea." The night before he left, they sat on the rooftop of the youth center, looking out at the skyline. "We made it, huh?" Jake said. Lily smiled. "Yeah, we did." As she watched him leave the next morning, she felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. Their journey had been hard, but they had survived. And that was all that mattered. As she walked back into the youth center, she knew one thing for sure: this was where she belonged. If you've liked this story, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends.